as I think most of you know, we have been trying to hold programs like this monthly to keep people engaged and informed about this issue. So thank you for turning out tonight. We had a great program a month ago on Acadia National Park, and tonight we're going to talk about salmon. I think it occurred to us that every day we're talking about salmon in this terms in relationship to this project, but how much do we really know about salmon, particularly Atlantic salmon, and its rich history in Maine? So we thought it might be interesting to sort of step back and learn more about this fish and how our wild Atlantic salmon population, relates to what people like American Aquafarms are trying to do. So we've got a great panel. Let me quickly introduce them in the order in which they're going to be presenting, and then we'll take your questions. Catherine Schmidt is a science communication specialist at the Schoodic Institute at Acadia National Park at the old naval installation right at the beginning of Schoodic Point. Catherine, I assume as a science communication specialist, you take all this scientific information and translate it into ways that the rest of us can understand it. Catherine is a prolific writer in many different publications, and she's the author of 3 books, including The President's Salmon: Restoring the King of Fish and Its Home Waters. John Burroughs is from the Atlantic Salmon Federation, an international organization with 25,000 members around the world. They do science and advocacy dedicated to conserving and restoring wild Atlantic salmon. And then our third speaker tonight, coming to us live from Franklin, is Dwayne Shaw, the executive director of the Downey Salmon Federation, which is a group that was founded by salmon anglers and is really focused on the rivers and watersheds and ecosystems in down East Maine. Their focus is on replenishing stocks, conserving and restoring habitat, and regional education and environmental advocacy. So it's a great panel, and I think we're all going to come away with much more knowledge about this fish that we spend so much time talking about, at least the wild version. So Catherine, I'll turn it over to you. And again, thank you all for being with us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me. It's great to see so much interest in wild Atlantic salmon this evening, and so many people willing to pay attention. There's a lot that's demanding our attention and a lot that's happening right now, so appreciate everyone's time. So this is the 50-million-year-old ancestor of all trout and salmon, including Atlantic salmon, Samo salar. They have been on this earth longer than humans. American and European populations of Atlantic salmon evolved separately around 250,000 years ago. So for hundreds of thousands of years, as the human race was emerging, salmon lived through various ice ages. They live with the ice and they learn to adapt to challenging conditions. Some of these adaptations include eggs that incubate in freshwater streams through long, cold winters, fast growth during short summers, an ability to tolerate fluctuations in water flow and temperature. They spend their youth in freshwater, migrate thousands of miles to the rich feeding grounds of the ocean, and then they return as adults to spawn in the very same waters where they hatched. Their historic range in the United States once extended to Long Island Sound and included the Penobscot River, the Union River, Tunk Stream, and Narraguagus, which remains their critical habitat today. There's also historic references to salmon in Flanders Stream in Sullivan and Cardinal Stream in Franklin. They like fast-moving, cold water with a lot of oxygen and beds of sand and gravel. The Atlantic salmon's ability to live in both freshwater and saltwater, to leap up waterfalls higher than 20 feet, to journey from mountain to sea and back again has inspired culture and stories and traditions throughout its range. Salmon adorn the walls and the floors of caves in France and Spain. Salmon appear in Celtic mythology as the holder of all spiritual knowledge. Polam are highly significant to the Wabanaki. Skamek, Penobscot word for salmon, provided an abundant, rich, and nutritious food that was eaten fresh, and it was also smoked and dried for winter. When they arrived on this shore, European colonists quickly recognized salmon because they knew it from back home, and a commercial and sustenance fishery immediately established. And just as quickly, people started expressing their concern for salmon. So they were being affected by dam construction associated with logging and sawmills and water power, and also a lack of compliance with the fishing laws that did exist. And so in response, a lot of people spoke up in defense of wild salmon, including the Penobscot tribe, petitioning the state of Massachusetts in 1801. And residents of towns up and down the Penobscot River petitioned the Maine legislature, pleading on behalf of the fish throughout the 1820s and 30s. So the Maine State Archives have dozens of these petitions. This is an image of what these fish petitions look like, where a whole bunch of people from a town or a couple neighboring towns would sign these petitions on behalf of the fish. Salmon could be found in local markets and distant markets in New York and Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C. Salmon with fresh peas and new potatoes was the traditional 4th of July meal in Maine. Fannie Farmer's Boston Cooking School cookbook advised home cooks that Penobscot River salmon are the best. The Penobscot was the center for the food fishery for salmon. In the late 1800s, at the fishery's peak, there were more than 200 weirs in Penobscot River and Bay, which the map that's on this slide, all of those little kind of crosshatch marks indicate a salmon weir. A salmon weir was a fence of sticks and brush that was set perpendicular to shore, and every fishing family had their own design. Salmon were also the focus of a major sport fishery, and Maine salmon rivers became a destination for fly fishermen and women from all over the region and farther afield, and many local people also fished. All of the salmon rivers hosted communities of anglers, and many, if not all of them, kept their fish to eat. This is the Bangor Salmon Pool and the waterworks, and this is the Brewer Shore, and you can see the waterworks in the distance. The Penobscot Salmon Club was founded in 1887 in Brewer, Maine. It's the first salmon club in the United States, and it is currently on the National Register of Historic Places. Anglers competed to catch the first fish, the biggest fish, the hardest fighting fish. It was daily news in the newspapers of river conditions and who was catching what. And in 1912, one of those anglers decided to send his first fish to the President of the United States. And so the presidential salmon tradition, it became an annual tradition. Every year, the first fish caught in the Penobscot River was sent to the President of the United States. But really, the salmon were already on the decline by 1912. So dams and logging and pollution were taking their toll. The average annual catch in the Penobscot River had fallen from 12,000 salmon in 1890 to 1,500 salmon in 1920. Fannie Farmer had dropped her reference to Penobscot River salmon. Commercial fishing for salmon ended in 1947, and recreational fishing sort of dwindled and came to an informal end in 1954 because the river, especially the Penobscot, was just too polluted for fish. There were no fish in the river, and a lot of fishing moved to the down east rivers in the 50s and 60s. So I want to share some quotes from Maine fisheries biologists that speak to the need for public support. The Maine Commissioner of Sea and Shore Fisheries in 1934 asked, "Are we going to let this valuable food supply slip from our last hold on it and go by default, or are we going to give it the protection it deserves?" 25 years later, biologist Dick Cutting knew that the success of the Penobscot River Restoration Program depended on the interest, desire, and initiative of the people of Maine. He knew that public indifference would doom the Atlantic salmon. Fortunately, people heeded the call, and many people continued to speak up in defense of wild salmon. So the Penobscot tribe, scientists, fly fishermen, local residents, the same people that helped to pass landmark environmental legislation in the 1970s, including and especially the Clean Water Act, which celebrates its 50th anniversary this year. People's attention and care brought back populations of Atlantic salmon and led to Maine salmon rivers being cleaner, more connected, and their watersheds more protected than at any time in the last 200 years. The presidential salmon tradition returned in 1981, although it was brief. Other changes were afoot. In 1988, the Penobscot Nation took their last salmon from the Penobscot River. Fly fishing ended in 1999, and Atlantic salmon were placed on the endangered species list in 2000, and that listing was expanded in 2009. Salmon are an endangered species, but this is not the most important lesson from this history. I think the most important thing to appreciate is that wild salmon are survivors. The photo on this slide is a male Atlantic salmon that had gone from the Penobscot River all the way to Greenland and back 3 times in its life. So, you know, the thing I think to remember about Atlantic salmon that's important is that not all of them die, most after spawning. So unlike Pacific salmon, some of them will live on to make the journey multiple times. So they're survivors and they're part of our shared heritage, and they're still here. And if we don't allow ourselves to become indifferent, if we give them just a little bit of attention, they will respond. But now, as in the past, they need our attention and they need us to speak up on their behalf. And so I'm glad to turn the screen over to John, who can bring us up to speed from the past to the present.
Great. Thank you very much, Catherine. I'm just going to pull up my slides. Oops. Actually, I've forgotten to share my screen first. All right, can everyone see that okay? All right, awesome. So my name is John Burrows. I am the Executive Director for U.S. Programs for the Atlantic Salmon Federation. The Atlantic Salmon Federation is an international nonprofit that's focused and dedicated on the conservation and restoration of wild Atlantic salmon and their environment. We are headquartered in St. Andrews, New Brunswick in Canada, but our small US office is in Brunswick, Maine, right next to the Androscoggin River, which once had a very large Atlantic salmon run, which in recent decades, has been individual fish most years, 1, 2, or 3, which is a fairly sad statement. ASF currently is focusing on 4 major issues, and we work across Maine, Atlantic Canada, and internationally. And so we're focused on eliminating unsustainable fisheries. There are still some fisheries for Atlantic salmon, particularly fisheries off of Greenland. There are a few still left in Europe, and there are some fisheries off the Faroe Islands and off of Labrador that take Atlantic salmon. We also have a tremendous research program and research staff, and that's really important for ASF because I think we have 5 or 6 biologists on staff. And we do a lot of work currently looking at survival of Atlantic salmon at sea. One of the major issues is back in 1990, there was a huge crash in at-sea survival, not just for Atlantic salmon, but for a variety of other fish species. And this is an indication of really macro level changes in the marine environment. And 30 years later, we're beginning to understand those quite a bit more, but they are likely related to climate change and other very high level things that we may not have much of an impact on. Two other issues. Reducing the impacts of open net pen salmon aquaculture is a major priority of ours, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then fourthly, or lastly, connecting, restoring access to historic habitat for Atlantic salmon and actually the entire suite of native seaworm fish species is a major priority of ours. And this is where a lot of our work in the US is focused. I'm going to talk a little bit about that before talking about issues with aquaculture. I have here slides of four dams on the Kennebec River. Dams are the #1 threat facing Atlantic salmon in the freshwater environment. This has been documented for quite a long time. Now, Catherine talked about the concern of dams going back, over 2 centuries. The recovery plan for Atlantic salmon highlights just how significant the impacts of large dams are on our rivers. I have Kennebec dams here, but I could just as easily be showing dams on the Androscoggin, the Penobscot, or the Union River, which are all significantly impacting our Atlantic salmon and where major changes need to happen if we're going to be able to recover the species. Right now, ASF is heavily focused on the Kennebec River dams and getting access to the upper portions of the Kennebec River. And that's our #1 priority in the US at this point in time. But it's not just big dams. We have a lot of small dams in Maine. We also have a lot of barriers and related to road crossings at streams. Currently, NOAA Fisheries estimates that Atlantic salmon have access to less than 10% of their historic habitat in the state just because of dams. And when you add in culverts and other things, it's a very small percentage of their habitat. So even though we've made great strides in removing some major dams and opening up a lot of habitat, we still have a very long ways to go. And through ASF's Maine Headwaters Project, we're doing work in many salmon watersheds to address those issues. Just a few examples, we've been involved with over a dozen small dam removal projects in the last 20 years. Where dam removal is not feasible or possible for a number of reasons, we build fishways. And this particularly works very well at lake and pond outlets, where oftentimes we're restoring access for alewives and other fish species into those ponds. And we've had great success at rebuilding alewife populations, particularly in the Penobscot River, where we've done over a dozen projects like this one that was done in the Duck Trap River. And as I mentioned before, road stream crossings, culverts are a huge issue for Atlantic salmon, brook trout, and other species. And we've done, about 20 of these types of projects in the past 20 years. Altogether, we've done more than 40 of these projects. We've opened up more than 1,000 miles of river and more than 25,000 acres of lake and pond habitat. And we've got a lot more going on in the next few years, which is going to open up hundreds of more miles of salmon habitat into some of the best areas. Now, transitioning to the issue of if folks could mute, that would be helpful. I'm getting a lot of feedback. Thank you. Ted asked me to talk about very quickly just the issues with Atlantic salmon that are raised in aquaculture facilities, basically farm-raised salmon, and what impact they have on wild Atlantic salmon. So I'm going to quickly go through the major issues and impacts associated with salmon aquaculture. I just want to be clear on 2 things. One, I'm talking about open net pen aquaculture. This is different technology than what is being proposed in Frenchman Bay, but the impacts or potential impacts are still the same. And also, we just want to point out that there's, excuse me, a lot of issues related to salmon, to aquaculture, with water quality, with aesthetics, recreation, commercial fisheries. Those are all major issues, but in terms of wild salmon impacts, there's only a few, which I'm going to touch upon, but want to acknowledge that there are many, many more issues that are out there. Here's a quote from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans in Canada. This basically outlines the three major issues associated with aquaculture salmon and wild salmon. I'll talk about each one of these. And it's a little bit ironic that this is a quote from DFO, because in Canada, DFO, which is a federal fisheries agency, is responsible and the only agency responsible for protecting and managing Atlantic salmon, yet they also support and manage and oversee the aquaculture industry. So there's a major conflict of interest there, and we've had many issues across Atlantic Canada dealing with the rapid expansion of the industry and DFO not taking impacts on wild Atlantic salmon seriously, despite the science and their own science supporting the need to do better in terms of regulation and management. The first major issue with farm salmon is that they escape. They often, with open net pens, have escaped frequently and in large numbers. When they escape, they often enter a lot of surrounding rivers, and they can travel very far. We've had escapes in the Bay of Fundy over Nova Scotia. We've had fish or escapes show up as far as the Penobscot River, which is over 100 miles away from those sites. These fish have the ability, to interbreed with wild salmon. This impacts their genetic diversity and genetic fitness. And this has been an issue which has been well documented on both sides of the Atlantic, where we have Atlantic salmon aquaculture. In Norway, which actually has probably the most rigorous regulations associated with aquaculture, they found that about 2/3 of their Atlantic salmon rivers have had hybrid salmon documented within them. In Newfoundland, which is just beginning to see rapid expansion of the aquaculture industry, on the South Shore, where there are 18 salmon rivers, 17 of them have been documented to have hybrid salmon, and more than a quarter of the population of returning adults in those rivers have been hybrids, or have also been wild escapes, purely wild fish. On the Magadavic River, which is just over the border from Maine and New Brunswick, which is actually centered in the heart of the aquaculture industry in the Outer Bay of Fundy. Just a little over 30 years ago, we had a run of 1,000 or so wild salmon in any one year. Since then, the numbers have plummeted. Today, in any given year, we may have 1 or 2, sometimes 0 wild salmon returning. This is a population which is on the brink of extinction. And the #1 issue there is aquaculture. There have been hundreds and hundreds of escaped aquaculture salmon that have entered the river. They've interbred with the wild population, and have basically, made that population much less fit. And also, with these wild fish swimming out of the river and passing through the aquaculture pens, have had major negative impacts in terms of survival, disease spread, and other things from the pens. Moving ahead, so farm salmon, are much less fit than wild salmon for, survival in the environment due to being bred to grow fast and to grow in pens. But when they do escape, they can and do compete with wild fish for habitat, for food and resources. And when you have small populations like we do in Maine, just a few escaped farm salmon can have major negative impacts on our wild fish. The second major issue is related to sea lice. Sea lice are naturally occurring in the North Atlantic. However, when you have salmon in large concentrations, like we do in salmon net pens, oftentimes we see major increases in densities of sea lice, which is associated with those net pens. These sea lice will attach to smolts, which are juvenile salmon migrating from our rivers to the ocean into Greenland. It only takes 4 to 6 sea lice on a salmon smolt to kill the smolt, which is a major issue. And sea lice are also a major vector for various diseases, from farm salmon to wild salmon. And just in one instance, in one study from Ireland, they found that there was a 50% decrease in wild salmon in the years immediately following outbreak of sea lice infestations in nearby aquaculture pens. And this is the story which has repeated itself time and time again, from Norway to the UK, to Canada and the US. Wherever you have large amounts of open net pen salmon aquaculture, you've had major decreases in wild salmon populations and numbers. And again, related to sea lice, but also somewhat separate, is the issue of disease spread. When you have any number of animals, whether it's fish or chickens or anything else cooped up together in very confined spaces, you have a great risk for disease. And farm salmon, have been known to have a wide variety of diseases that are naturally occurring. But again, when you have fish in high densities, you get an outbreak of one of these diseases, it spreads rapidly, not just amongst the farm fish, but then can be transferred to any wild fish that are swimming by, and can be transmitted by a sea lice to those wild fish. We've had major outbreaks of some of these diseases in North America. Infectious salmon anemia is the most well-known, and there have been major issues throughout Atlantic Canada with this, and we've had some outbreaks here in Maine, though due to changes in regulation here, it's been much less of an issue, but it has not gone away. There was a report a few years ago that actually looked at salmon aquaculture at a global scale, and looking at kind of across the North Atlantic, researchers found that where you have salmon aquaculture, the survival and abundance of wild salmon populations has decreased by 50% per each generation of wild salmon on average. And these are impacts that have occurred in all jurisdictions and despite regulation in those places. Lastly, I wanted to share this book with folks. Toxic by Richard Flanagan came out in just about a year ago in 2001. This talks about the salmon farming industry in Tasmania, of all places. There is a huge Atlantic salmon farming industry in Tasmania, which feeds the Australians, which have a huge appetite for salmon. Richard Flanagan is a Booker Prize-winning, award-winning novelist, but is a native of Tasmania. And so he did a very thorough investigation and study of the salmon farming industry in Tasmania. And I bring this up because Tasmania and the situation that happened and what's transpired there is actually not dissimilar to Frenchman Bay. Tasmania, obviously doesn't have wild Atlantic salmon. They don't have any native salmon. Yet the impacts from the industry there have had huge impacts on water quality in the bays, have impacted recreational use, have done a whole lot to the ecosystems along Tasmania, which prior to salmon aquaculture were pristine or relatively close to pristine. And so a lot of the issues beyond the ones on wild salmon that we're aware of that are potentially huge issues in Frenchman Bay have been experienced in recent decades in Tasmania. And so I recommend that folks read this book. It's an incredibly interesting read and really covers a lot of the issues associated with the industry that are not related to impacts on wild salmon. And that is my final slide. And I believe I'm handing things over now to Dwayne Shaw. So thank you, folks.
Thank you, John. Let's see, I'm trying to share my screen here. Okay, thank you. Well, John and Catherine, you did a tremendous job of sort of some historical background and then the context of the Atlantic salmon issues around the world. And what I'd like to do is to bring us down into the local, more localized levels here. As was mentioned earlier, our organization, the Downy Salmon Federation, is based in Eastern Maine. We were established 40 years ago. 10 years after Clean Water Act, and in the Endangered Species Act and by local anglers who were concerned about the local rivers and in fact the emphasis or the lack of emphasis on the rivers in eastern Maine and the extended emphasis on the Penobscot. So those groups were on the Denny's River, the Machias River, the East Machias, the Pleasant, the Narraguagus, and the Union. So it's this coast east of the Penobscot. We've worked very, very closely with the Atlantic Salmon Federation. We share many of the same priorities, and we've gone another step into the management of these wild fish, wild Atlantic salmon, and that is on the hatchery end of the supplementation of the rivers once we've restored the, as we like refer to, the broken rivers. And the fish can be broken as well. They could be broken by genetic introgression with these non-wild salmon. And as I think most people know, along with the salmon listing came a very big controversy. So the most recent era of controversy around Atlantic salmon included conversations along the lines of, well, there are so many salmon in the net pens out there, how could they possibly be endangered, and things like that echoed up and down through our political machinations to get to the point where we resolved the issue that yes, there are wild fish remaining here, and I think what that did was to reboot the conversation about, is the game over, or is it still game on for Atlantic salmon? And I like to say we're just getting started. And to be realistic about this, we have a lot of work to do. There's been a lot of kicking it down the road and ignoring the issue despite the tremendous investments. The work is ongoing, and we've seen in other places around the world, particularly Norway, and in some places in England, tremendous recovery. So part of the justification for this emphasis on aquaculture is a narrative that wild fish are gone and they're never coming back. So give up and let us in. Well, what I like to say is, no, we're just getting warmed up, and we have work to do, and we know that it can be done, and we're seeing it over and over again that we can recover wild fish. So this is the map of the designated critical habitat for the Atlantic salmon for those remaining populations that exist. They're river-specific populations, and that they're now in today's era of conservation biology being managed as separate individual populations. So they're not being mixed anymore. The mistakes of the past before we understood genetics are not being perpetuated today. So the Pleasant River is managed separately from the Narraguagus, even though they are adjoining watersheds. So the genetics questions that underpin the final decision to list the fish are being used to now move forward with a much more modern approach to fisheries recovery. And we see this with California condors. You can use many, many different species and look at the examples of intervention toward the recovery of an endangered species. This map shows the vacant habitat. So if you look at the prior map showed the critical habitat designation, but as John had said, many places are inaccessible. The rivers are broken. When you fix the river, it's like building a brand new river again. However, the salmon aren't going to miraculously appear on their own. So yes, we have remnant populations, but we're unfortunately dependent upon this intervention called hatchery. So the hatchery interventions also are evolving. Along with our work to restore the rivers comes with it innovations in the, as I said, the genetics, but also in the husbandry of the fish when they're in captivity. So as you see, there's a lot of open space there, vacant though designated historic and designated critical under the ESA. So how are we going to get the fish back there? They're not going to wander in from Newfoundland or Labrador. We want to build off of the remnant strains that we have. So the Craig Brook National Fish Hatchery has been turned into essentially 6 hatcheries that hold 6 different stocks of fish. As we say, not all breakthroughs necessarily look like dam removals. This is a dam removal we did in East Machias. We then took the power plant that was associated with this, and we turned it into this very innovative conservation hatchery, modeled after a hatchery on the River Tyne in England, where we've seen one of the biggest salmon recovery success stories in all of Europe, where they're now seeing over 10,000 salmon returning to a river that was polluted and essentially depauperate of salmon back in the 60s. So that recovery began in the 80s, and now they're fishing again, and they're turning the hatchery off. The goal is to turn the hatchery off, of course. But we're dependent upon hatcheries, and we're limited by the capacity in our hatcheries. And this is an aquaculture tool. So we at DSF operate 2 hatcheries. We have a Section 10 permit under the Endangered Species Act. Very unusual circumstance. No other organization has such a permit. We're a non-governmental organization, but we have a cooperative arrangement, and we're essentially running these very large experiments. And on the East Machias, we've done this using the Tyne model or method, where the tanks are black. We use substrate incubators. The water is accelerated. The water is not filtered. The fish are raised in the water of origin. So these are East Machias fish being raised in the East Machias River system. And lo and behold, it actually works. And we have now over 10 years of data to show that it's not game over. There's some data to illustrate the point. You can see here that different stocking approaches being used in different locations and being measured over time. And what this is pointing to the number of adult returns that you see based upon what fish you put in. They're all of the same genetics, and over time, the difference in the way that the fish are being reared makes a difference ultimately, and if they survive once you put them out. There are, of course, habitat issues that we're working on. Has been mentioned. pH is another one that limits perhaps the capacity of our rivers currently. And that too can be addressed, just like the Norwegians and people in Nova Scotia have been working very hard. We've begun to look at additions of calcium to put the pH back to the natural level, pre-industrial acid rain standards. Attitudes. This is a great example of how we got into the mess we're in. There were pressures, of course, and we know this, just as there are with any pressures for a limited resource. Why would we have to build a fishway in a dam in Ellsworth? Why should we do that? And this was the dam prior to the one that's there currently, but the same argument continued to this day. And this was, you might take a guess of who the people are who had perhaps the intemperate habits. Perhaps they were indigenous people who were bringing those petitions forward and so on, saying, hey, our culture depends on this. And there were other fishers who were very, very interested in pushing against this. They lost. We're fighting still. And I'll talk about the dam right here in Ellsworth. Salmon didn't evolve alone. They, of course, evolved with insects that they feed upon, but they also evolved with the sweet. We call it the diadromous sweet. So these are not to scale, no pun intended, but these are the fish that you would see coming up and down the rivers. They have to get, they're obligated to put themselves into fresh water or salt water, and their life history requires that they get there from here. Right local in Flanders Bay, this was a brook called Smelt Brook. It's still called Smelt Brook. It had about 3 smelt eggs on this dam when we first discovered this dam as we were surveying smelt streams. And of course, we know that Atlantic salmon and smelt go together like peanut butter and jelly. Salmon they just love smelts. And when they come out of the rivers, the smelts are coming in, and it's their first meal as adults going back to sea, like the one that went back to Greenland 3 times. But if you don't have smelts in Smelt Brook, the salmon are going to be impaired, and those people and other creatures that like smelts are going to have a problem. So Smelt Brook, Flanders Bay, no smelts, a few still spawning on the dam right at the head of tide. What stewardship means ultimately is that someone takes action, and that's just what our organization did in partnership. We ultimately had to buy the property. We bought the property. This is right next to the big saltwater farm that's for sale now for over $3 million. Next door, the Watson farm, historic Watson farm. And this was built to create a watering hole for cattle. So we bought this and brought the equipment in, and we took it out. So we bought the property, removed it, and shortly thereafter, this is what it looked like. The sea came back in to meet the fresh water, and you see the cattails that had died as a result of the saltwater being back on the historically salt marsh flats there. Salt marsh is restoring itself, and lo and behold, the smelts came back immediately. So did the tomcod. So did the sea run brook trout. That was a little dam. Here's a big one, also in the neighborhood. This is the Union River Dam. And this is the first source of electricity to Blue Hill, first source of electricity to Bar Harbor. This is 1907 when it was built, and a source of electricity for cable cars in Brewer. That was its primary purpose when built. It was a tremendous achievement. However, they forgot one big thing, or they neglected one big thing, and that was fish passage. So at the time, 1907, the state of Maine had just outlawed the use of dynamite for commercial fishing, which had to be studied, of course, and was debated at some length before it was finally done. But part of the belief was there are plenty of fish in the sea. We could just do this one river, and people can get fish elsewhere. Well, the fishway wasn't built. Those that were fighting for it lost the fight, but you also notice something very unusual, the color of the water. In this particular case, this is associated with another dam upstream. In the other dam upstream is the Graham Lake Dam. And what you see here is a tributary Branch Lake stream coming into the Union River just above downtown Ellsworth. The drinking water supply has been well protected in Ellsworth at Branch Lake. So you see it's very clean water, like what a salmon and other fish would like, trout and so on. But what's coming down from Graham Lake is mud. So they're technically in violation of Clean Water Act there. However, the can got kicked down the road because of the way the relicensing programs work. We need help on this project. This is what stewardship is of our natural resources. If we want fish in Flanders, Blue Hill, Frenchman, and elsewhere, we need the golden goose, and these rivers are the golden goose that will lay this egg over and over and over. I call it perpetual motion machine. These rivers can act as pumps. They're bringing energy into the inland through the fish and putting fish back out to the sea. That, of course, things like halibut feed on, and cod and other fish that we would love to see recovered. That's Graham Lake when they draw it down under the new licensing provisions, thanks to outcry like what we've had at Frenchman Bay. The energy around fighting the net pens at Frenchman Bay also need to be applied to this situation. It's absolutely critical It's a 500 square mile watershed in Hancock County in jeopardy, and the license is up for renewal now. It's a 40-year license. In our neighborhood also exists some other tools for salmon recovery, like the Green Lake National Fish Hatchery, built for salmon recovery in the Union River watershed, not stocking the Union River watershed because of the dams. It's stocking other rivers because the situation in the Union is so disastrous. In Taunton Bay, we have the University CCAR facility, aquaculture research facility, and the USDA's salmon culture facility, set side by side. There are wild salmon in that facility right now for stocking, not in this region, because the stewardship of this region has been so poor. The fish are going elsewhere. They're going to the Penobscot and over to the Machias River from that facility right here in our backyards. I live just right behind the photo here. So the Singing Bridge and the Reversing Falls are just right there. Green Lake Hatchery, CCAR in Taunton Bay, Hog Bay in the background. So these tools are available, the habitat's there, the people are here, the interest is here, and we need to really come forward with expressions of that interest in real terms, just like what we're doing to fight in Frenchman Bay. We need to be looking at the eelgrass in Frenchman Bay. We need to be looking at the dams in the region and some of these other issues. I just put this up. DSF is in the middle of a fundraising campaign to do some of our work to stock fish into the Narraguagus, the Pleasant, in the East Machias, and this is one of our big landmark breakthroughs on the hatchery side of things in getting, after 10 years of private investment, the federal agencies to come in and say, we've seen the data, we're working with you, and we'd like to help you continue that work. That's all.
Well, thank you, Dwayne. Thank you, John and Catherine. I think I can speak for all of us that we have learned an awful lot about Atlantic salmon in the last 40 minutes and the threats that the American Aquafarms project poses to all this incredible work to restore the native population. We were going to try and wrap up by about 6:30, but I'm sure there are questions. If you have questions for our panelists, please raise your hand in the down in the reactions button. There's something you can click to raise your hand, and I believe my Frenchman's Bay United colleague Catherine Rybarge is going to moderate this part of it and call on people to ask their questions.
Let me see. David Seaton, go ahead.
Yes, I have a question about why Maine will not list the Atlantic endangered when the federal government has already done that. And I'm not sure I understand why our DMR has refused to list them. Is it because they knew Aquafarms would be applied for and they felt that that would be an impediment to Aquafarms? Or is there some other reason that they will, or does it not matter if they list them, I guess? That's my question.
I would love to address that.
Good.
People have called the Atlantic salmon the spotted owl of the East. It is a headache. It is a very big headache, and it has been for over 200 years. And the state of Maine has not reconciled with the fact that they have an endangered species. They, meaning the agencies at the political uppermost levels. Has been and continues to be substantial pushback at the political levels around this. And it's because the industry, largely because of industry pushback. And that is really a reconciliation. I look at it strictly in those terms. Scientifically, we have an endangered species. There are many other species listed, included red-fin pickerel and other things that people have never heard of on that state list. Beautiful posters produced by our agencies. But when it comes to Atlantic salmon, boy, they have a lot of footprint, and it's just it's been a very big hot potato for a very long time.
Can I just add to that, Dwayne? Because there was a similar question in the chat, and it does matter. So to the question, it does matter because it's not just politically and sort of from applying the law and doing everything we can to restore an endangered species. I mean, that's an obligation, right? There's an obligation to restore the species, and the federal agencies, like they by law, they have to recover the species. But it matters symbolically because it matters the attention and the support that that salmon need. And so it would make a difference.
Okay, thank you.
Any other
We have
questions? Not seeing any. In the chat, just James, you can be next. In the chat, Kate has put a nativefishcoalition.org campaign. They're the ones behind the Maine putting it as a endangered species for the state. So you can get that reference if you're interested. Go ahead, James.
There are many groups that lined up behind this very recently, and Native Fish Coalition have been really helping to ring the bell. Yes.
Hi, I'm Jim O'Connell from Bar Harbor, and I've been fighting for against the corridor because the electricity comes from hydro up in Quebec, and there has been a big argument against the hydro based on the fact that it's cutting off all the nutrients in the springtime during the spring flood to all the nursery in the ocean, and has depleted the ocean stocks of fishes. And some of these, of course, are what salmon eat. I wonder if there any studies going on about the actual phytoplankton that's not getting to grow because of the Union River Dam and is depleting our fishes and etc.
Thanks, Jim.
There was a book called Blue Deserts, which I would point at, and it's a Sebago Lake activist has put it together, and it's quite remarkable in its explanation of this major problem, it seems to be. Thank you.
We're certainly see with the Union River major problems for water quality related to the dams, including, of course, fish passage, which are covered as part of the Clean Water Act fishable, swimmable standards. So yes, all hydro is not green, and very little hydro truly you could consider green. There are also issues with the impoundments discharging methane, which is a gas, of course, greenhouse gas. So yes, when people talk about hydro as being part of the portfolio, you really want to start to think about that, especially in terms of fish passage, certainly.
Yeah.
In the case of the Union River, the power there, I think we've calculated something less than 60 acres of solar panels could replace the power that's generated from that. It's impairing a 500 square mile watershed, and on the downstream side, of course, impairing the nearshore environment, the bays, by virtue of the lack of all of these native species and the underlying chemistry and so on.
Jerry Crone, you're next.
Hello, I'm Jerry Crone from Birch Harbor, and I've got one issue that I'd like to speak to and three subordinate questions to that issue. American Aquafarms in the DEP application, they advocate for a stocking factor in their feedlots of 35 kilograms per cubic meter, which turns out being 59 pounds per cubic yard. of fish. And if the adult weight of an adult salmon is 10 pounds, that's 6 30-inch long fish permitted in a 3-foot cube. And so my questions become, and there are 3 subordinate questions. At what stocking factor is the salmon prone to anxiety? At what stocking factor is aggression a factor? And lastly, at what stocking factor does cruelty become an issue? I don't know whether any one of those 3 questions can be addressed by the experts this evening, but if you do find out some research on that and could provide that by email to everyone, I think it would be interesting. Thank you.
Jerry, those are some great questions. I actually can't answer them. I think there is some literature out there on some of that. What I can say is that densities like that are, I don't think anything close to that's allowed anywhere in the world for salmon. And so you're talking about, crowding these fish in, fin to fin. It's an issue for fish health, and a whole bunch of other stuff. But in terms of some of your other questions, I actually can't answer them, so I apologize for that.
Thank you.
I think it's important to remember that the vast differences between wild salmon and domesticated version of that. So the wild turkey and the domesticated turkey can't find its way out of a box, whereas a wild turkey is a completely different creature. And that's what we're seeing with the domestication of Atlantic salmon. So they're breeding them specifically, intensively. And even in the town where I sit, the USDA facility here in Franklin and Sullivan is built solely to do that, to domesticate this fish. So they're breeding the wildness out of them, and it's a different creature altogether.
Yeah, that's a great point that Dwayne just made. I mean, they're the same species, but they are completely different critters altogether when it comes to behavior and everything else.
I have a question of my own. I heard that there was 3 or 4 fish found at Union River at the base of the dam this year, farm salmon. Dwayne, can you address what happens with that and where we can figure out where they came from?
Yes, that's true. And they did come from Cook Aquaculture's disastrous event there near near MDI, I guess it was Frenchboro or somewhere. And they escaped as part of the die-off event that happened in their net pens. And they have enough instinct left in them to seek fresh water at times, some of them. And they appeared in the trap at the base of the dam. So there's a trap and truck system there that was forced upon the dam owners many years back at the last relicensing 40 years ago. And that system is in place, and some wild salmon are showing up, wandering in from the Penobscot or the Narraguagus. But these aquaculture fish that escape, as John had mentioned, do show up, and they're released back downstream. So they're tested for genetics, and you can tell by the shape of the fish often that they're an aquaculture escape as well. So if they showed up in the Union, they probably went to other places. They may have gone up into Card Mill and Donnell Pond or Flanders or the Narraguagus, and in places where they may not have been detected.
Thank you. Anybody else with a question? Because we're about to close up this evening.
Great. Well, thank you again for everybody who turned out for this. We'll keep you posted on what our next program is. Dwayne got his fundraising appeal in. I think all our organizations will gladly take your donations. This fight is a very expensive fight, and And you can find out more information about what Frenchman's Bay United is doing at frenchmanbayunited.org and our Facebook page. Thank you to our panelists. Please buy Catherine's book. You really have done an amazing job tonight telling us about Atlantic salmon, educating us and tying it to this fight that we are all in to stop this destructive project in Frenchman Bay. So thank you to our panelists and thank you to all of you for being with us, and we will see you again next month.
Thank you, Ted. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.